Welcome everybody to HTT Theater. This is painting marble. So today we're going to talk about how to do some faux marble techniques. My name is Jayme Mellema. I am the scenic designer and painter here for University Theater. So yeah, that's what I do. And there are a lot of different ways to do paint techniques, and so these are just some of the ones that I happen to like, but others will have more. So I guess take everything I say with a little bit of a grain of salt. Everyone has their own way of doing things, right? What I'm going to be talking primarily about today is painting on hard surfaces and not things like drops or soft surfaces. The principles are pretty much the same. You can do all the same things that I'm going to show you. It's just that the type of paint and the thickness of your paint is going to be very different. A lot of my experience with marble and painting in general is with a lot of floors. So that's, I'll probably will reference that a lot. And so why do we need to do these? Well, usually because we don't have a lot of real marble laying around to put on our floors or surfaces. And most scenery that we build has to have some kind of treatment done to it to make it look more alive and lived in. So we need to provide that surface depth, and that's usually with a lot of paint. And in fact, with scenic paint, how we achieve a lot of that depth is with layers. So lots of thin layers of paint. So we'll show you some of that today. And nearly every surface on stage needs to have some kind of texture added because the stage lighting typically washes a lot of it out. Even if you put raw wood on stage, it does not look like wood because it just looks white. So you have to paint that wood to look like wood, which is a large portion of my job. What I'm going to be demonstrating for you today is, very close up. We have this great camera that's going to zoom in, and it's going to, most of the stuff is meant to be viewed from a distance by the audience, right? How exaggerated you get with some of these techniques can vary depending on how close it is to an audience. The audience is further away, you might need to exaggerate things a little more. If they're really close up on it, you might need to be more fine and detailed with the work that you're doing. So that can be a big impact on the choices that you're making. So when we're painting scenery, I paint with scenic paint, and it's made specifically for theater. This one happens to be from Roscoe, called Off-Broadway. And there's a couple reasons why we use paint specifically made for the theater. In this case, if you've ever seen house paint mixed at the paint store or at the hardware store, you'll notice that the can is already mostly full when they open it up to put the pigment in it, which means you get like this much pigment and this much other stuff. And paint is made up of 3 basic main ingredients. There's a lot more, but it comes down to that pigment is number 1. Number 2 is the vehicle, the stuff that keeps it moving around in liquid. And then 3 is binder, which is the stickum stuff, the glue that holds it to surfaces and allows it to adhere. So you can imagine for latex paint, the stickum is glue. I'm sorry, not glue, is latex, rubber. So your walls are coated in rubber. So the reason we use scenic paint is because that ratio of those ingredients is different than a house paint. So instead of having that tiny little bit of pigment in it, the ratio of pigment is much greater, which means it has less glue and it has less vehicle. So sometimes it's a little thicker and sometimes it'll come off if you get it wet again, which is why we apply a sealer coat at the end of things or sometimes in the middle of a process. So that's why it's important to use, well, the reason that we want that is because we like to thin this down so we can do lots of thin layers. And if we only have this much pigment to thin down, it doesn't stretch nearly as far or look very good. So we want as much pigment as we can get for thinning down. In fact, you can use dyes or things like super saturated paint as well, which is even stronger pigment. And they stretch much, much further, particularly if you're doing soft goods like drops and that sort of thing. You want really strong pigment, really thin. A lot of dye gets used and things like supersats, but these work great for that too. So the cost can be a little cost prohibitive for folks with smaller theaters or high schools and such. Honestly, with the cost of house paint going up these days, the investment really is not that much different. I would just slowly start getting a can or two per show and just slowly build it up, because this stuff lasts more than one show. You're not going through nearly as much of it by watering it down. So I highly recommend using it. So let's get into marble. Before we can talk about how to paint marble, it's really, really important to know how marble is created. So I'm going to pretend for a hot second that I'm a geology person, which I'm 100% not. And we're going to talk a little bit about rock. And I have a bunch of pictures and examples to go with this. So marble happens, well, I'm going to use my notes specifically on this one because, like I said, not an expert. Marble is created through metamorphism of limestone, and that happens from an application of heat and pressure, and sometimes chemical reactions between different kinds of stone and sediment, minerals. So that heat can come from, it's usually not direct heat like, like lava flow heat, like not as hot as lava, but it is sort of like, it could be lava adjacent. So if your ground is heated up because of a lava flow, it can create marble. But it comes from a lot of heat and pressure from movement of plates and things. That's why you find some in places like Tennessee and such with the mountains, and particularly in Italy with the volcanic activity and such. So that's why it shows up in really specific spots. And there's a lot of variety and color to the different kinds of marble, and the color comes from the different minerals and sediments that end up inside of it or adjacent to it. Because marble is sort of made up of layers, a lot of layers, and those layers are what cause all those beautiful lines and things to happen. So, all right, so that veining and those colors, I have a bunch of examples. I'm going to show you some things, and again, this is really important when it comes to painting, and you'll see in a little bit why. So I know it's a little odd to start with geology on our paint. All right, so this is a pretty standard basic marble. And we would call this a drift marble, which is the sheets or layers of crystallized minerals within a marble. And you can see those are usually deposited by water, which then evaporates, leaving just the minerals, which causes those great like linear lines and veins. And so how they're cut can create, like cut by the folks who are cutting the marble can make a big difference. So if you cut it with the veins, you get these beautiful long delicate lines like this. It looks very linear. Serpentine veins, or tree veining, branches out in many directions, right? So these are some examples of serpentine veins. And they go in different directions. They don't follow that nice linear path as much. And this is what is an example of what's called breccia veins, which are broken. And so it's a whole bunch of rock that's been broken. So it's into lots of tiny chunks. And then you've got sediment that's settled in between them and reformed. So it looks very different. And of course, you're going to have some of these in all of your marble in different ways or another, which is why it's important to know what they are and why they exist. In order to paint them, you need to know why they exist. And as you can see in like this is more breccia, right? So this is really, really broken up into really fine texture. So these are examples of it being cut with the grain, so linearly. And more breccia, yep. More breccia. So here's cutting a marble across the grain of it. This shows you, it like creates much swirlier look versus the linear look, which is a very different thing. And it's not very typical. It's a little more decorative. And so you might see it in a higher end spaces, but yeah, more linear. And that's the end of that. In all cases, you could see it's like extremely organic, and there's not a lot of pattern to what it's doing. There is sort of like a look or a vibe to each of those different styles, which is why I wanted to show them to you. So you understand why it is we're painting them the way that we are. because there are so many varieties and options, having research that you're working from or a rendering from your designer or whatever it is, is really, really important. You shouldn't be just painting straight out of your head. You need to be referencing something because there literally are like so many varieties. I'm going to show you this book here. This is a surfaces book, which is fantastic. I'm going to try and get that in view. There we go. And you can see this is the variety, the different kinds of marble options that are there. That's just one page, but there are more and more pages of this stuff. So like knowing what it is that you're wanting to paint is important for this reason. Because there, so many. And then how they're used is very different and unique too. So having research for what you're doing is super helpful. All right. So like all of that gives you so many options as a designer, right? Like it's so much stuff, but you have to also think like, how busy is it going to look on stage? Because sometimes these really exotic marbles can be really a whole lot to look at and maybe too much, and might really sort of overpower your set. So like you have to think very thoughtfully and carefully about why it is you're choosing what you're choosing. Some things work better with like a more fantasy sets versus something that's supposed to look realistic. So keeping all that in mind is important. So you want to prep your surfaces. Where's my first lead? Right. Because the ultimate end result, ideally is shiny, which means you want to have it be glossy. You don't want your surface to have a whole lot of texture to it. So having it clean, sanded, and all that stuff is important. Mine probably, because I'm reusing samples, they're full of all kinds of bumps, and you'll probably see them as we go along. But for you, you should totally try and keep them nice and neat. In this case, I've sort of basted a light gray, but a lot of times you can simply base them white, or if you're doing a dark marble, you could start with a black or dark brown, depending on the marble you're working with. But for this one, like this one, I've done this light gray, and then for I'm going to show you two different ones today. This one's going to be light gray, and then I'll show you one that just uses a black base. All right, so demo number one, we're going to start. This is going to be a lighter tone drift marble. And I do have a reference I'm using for it. Yeah, so that's the guy there, the one marked with the Post-it. It's kind of this tannish, whitish, grayish marble. That was my inspiration for this. I'm working with something specific, so I know what colors to use. So the first thing I want to do is a wet blend of, I'm going to do 3 different colors. 2 colors seem to be most dominant in it, are the tan color, right? I need a little bit of water. So in general, marble uses a lot of wet paint, and you'd say, but all paint is wet. But this uses a lot of water. And one of the things you want to be doing definitely is keeping it very directional. If this particular one had a definite kind of direction to the colors that were happening, right? So the tan was sort of the dominant color, and then I feel like white was the other one. And I'll probably throw in a little bit of a gray too. That's kind of the base color. And this is called a wet blend. Another term might be scumble, right? But the scumbles tend to be more blocky and blotchy and not directional. So I guess that's partly why I don't use that term here. And how about like a little bit of gray, just because. Yeah. And then I'm going to go over it here. Is there a question?
The question is, what type of surface do you like best for this?
Thin? It doesn't really matter, but smooth is important. That's what I was saying earlier. I'm going to blend this out while we talk. I'm just trying to get this a little bit less blotchy a little bit softer. So yeah, smooth is important. So I think the other thing that's important is it's a little more difficult to do this sort of thing on something that's vertical because it does use an awful lot of water. So for instance, like if you're doing a pedestal that has like a bust on it or something, like it might be good to be able to lay it down and do each side one at a time sort of thing. But this piece happens to be like Luan. You could just as easily be doing it on masonite or MDF. The surface doesn't really matter. Trying to keep it as smooth as possible does a little bit. So it's best if it's smooth. Like you can do things like, you know, a whole pedestal that's already got all the molding and trim and everything on it. You can totally do that. It's just that you need to like get in all those cracks and crevices and stuff, which is a little bit harder. So I've got this spray bottle here with just water in it. So I want to keep this surface really wet because I'm going to keep working on it while it's wet. Now, if this was on like a floor, you could use a large like garden sprayer to be spraying the floor, and you'd be using bigger brushes on bamboo, right? So that'll help keep my surface wet. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those same brushes I was using with the colors and just dab a little bit of water on them, and I'm going to just spatter some of the color onto them for texture, because it's all about texture. So some of the really heavy texture ones you'd want to do a lot of texture on. So I'm just using those same two colors to add a little texture to it. And you can also use a sponge to dab areas if you want to blend it out. It kind of creates a little bit of a different kind of texture. And I'm going to use this bad boy more in just a second. Because I'm going to go ahead and like already start veining this. So like I was saying, lots of water, wet on wet. Even after I've spattered it, I could spray it again. So you can use sponges, rags, spatter. It's whatever the texture needs from your research, right? All right. Yeah, veining is next. So veins are not random, right? That's that layers of sediment that's happening. I'm going to do another spatter, this time with that dark gray from the research. And I'm using sort of a thinned down version of that dark gray. And I'm just going to really loosely spatter this. So I've created that directionality here, right? I'm going to kind of loosely just throw some in here and throw that on there. And that's going to, it's like, okay, that's going to be where my veins go, right? Because those veins go and there's usually it's like extra sediment of stuff. And so for this vein, because this is like, I consider this like an under veining. You got to imagine it's sort of deeper, further down inside the rock. So you want it to be softer. So I'm spraying it again. And I'm going to use this brush here. It's kind of beat up. In general, like for a lot of stuff, beat up brushes work best. Now I'm going to get some of more of that same gray paint, the dark gray. And I'm going to throw in some veins. Now, this should be, like I said, directional. And this should be sort of like a jagged natural veins. If it's too smooth and wavy, right, it doesn't look real. It doesn't look like something created by rock. Rock is sort of jagged, even though marble looks very smooth. I'm going to kind of start here where it's already dark. And I'm just rolling my brush. And I'm kind of following this line. Get a little bit more paint. I'm going to do the same thing here. Often you're using the side of your brush. I'm moving it around a lot. Things you want to avoid, and I'm going to do some do's and don'ts with veining in just a minute, but like you don't want to cross this way with your veining, right? You want to add more veins, but look, I can already see this guy kind of exists a little bit. I'm going to just follow him. And it's okay if it looks a little blended out right now. Like I said, this is meant to be the under veining, the stuff that's further down inside the rock. So Now I'm going to take a little bit of my sponge to kind of blend out some of the softer areas, right? Because I want some of it to look like it's very present, and some of it to recede further down into the rock. So I'm going to blend out some of this dark gray spatter. Maybe this vein a little bit. We're going to come back to the veining again, so don't worry. I feel like it needs another one somewhere. Maybe just down here. And then I would give it like a spray again. And then that's going to be step one. That's a whole lot for step one. So I'm going to set this dude to dry now. So I was trying to follow the color like a guideline, right? So the spatter sort of helped give me a path to follow that felt random. Trying to keep things random and natural is really difficult. Humans like to make patterns out of things. So keeping things from feeling patterned is really important. Oh, there was one more step I wanted to do. Haha. I want to add like a big blotchy vein of straight tan color. Usually kind of right near the tan areas. And you can blend these out if needed too, but I kind of like how they look there. Sometimes it works really well to blend one side of something out. You leave a hard edge and then it blends out. It kind of looks really good. All right, last spray now on that. Then I'm going to set that aside to dry. So here's one I have that's already nice and dry. So it looks a little different and it's a little smaller. Same idea, it was created the same exact way. You can see there's some of that veining of the beige or tan color. We've got our gray veins. There's obviously some spatter in here and some sponging happening. Before I go to this, I'm actually going to show you a little bit more about veining. Hold that thought. I wanted to do a few do's and don'ts on veining and to show you some of the different kinds of tools you could use for veining, right? A lot of people talk about the feather, or they use the feather for this. The feather comes up a lot, I think, in like faux finishing communities, like things like furniture and walls in your home, which makes a lot of sense for those scenarios. Right? I like that it can get kind of jaggedy, which is nice, and works really well for jaggedy versions of that. It's handy, but I think for larger work or for painters, it's a little harder to work with. If you're doing, again, like a pedestal or something, that could work really well. I'm using a pretty dark color here just to be a little bit extreme, just so you can see it. I really like these kinds of brushes. This might be a little hard to see. It's just a small sash, a nice fine point. I'm going to use this guy a lot for our next step. You can do very similar things. You can get really nice fine lines out of it. You can do a lot of twists. It's important that you're like marble lines have a lot of different dimension to them. They are not, so they tend to be jaggedy. They tend to vary in width. This is what they don't do. Like they don't tend to be very like the same all the way across, right? Without any variation. And they don't tend to be like really swirly. Right? They don't do that so much. You may find an example, and it may work if you're in that context, but they typically don't. And they also don't tend to like cross each other this direction, right? So again, there are exceptions. Some serpentine definitely does cross each other, and I'm going to do that for our dark sample. So I'll show you how to do that effectively in just a minute. But for typically, for the kind that you see in most homes, it doesn't really do that very much. I've never done this. I'm literally doing it for the first time right now. But I've heard you can use the edge of your roller, like just the end. So let's give that a try. Oh yeah, that kind of works pretty cool. I can see like for a large marble, you're not wanting to like hover over you know, with a brush. Like that's the thing, if you're working on a floor, you don't want to be bending over on your hands and knees doing this stuff. You want to be finding a way to do it when you're standing up. So you can also use larger sash brushes like this one. And I'm going to use this with white. I'm going to show you more with this. For the dark sample, I'm going to show you more of this. But, oh man, I'm running out of room. But it basically works the same way as the large sash, only bigger. So it just gives you a larger scale, which on the floor or whatever might come in really handy if the scale is bigger, what you're doing. So running out of room. It works well for serpentine as well because you can get some really great sharp lines. And move back to our other demo. I think we're good. The other thing you want to avoid is kind of what I've done here a little bit. Which is even spacing of stuff. Like it doesn't really happen naturally very much. There are always exceptions, but typically they're not like a lot of evenly spaced lines. And they do tend to run into each other some, like they're cracks essentially, right? They're cracks that have been filled with sediment. And you can always soften them with a sponge too. This has got that other color on it now, but you could use just a damp sponge to soften lines. As you go, which you'll see because I'm going to do a bunch of. All right, let's go back to our actual sample here. All right, this one's got a lot of fun work going on here. If this is under veining, right? If this is the veining that's further away inside the rock, then I want to come in with something stronger and darker. So I'm using that same dark color that we used to spatter with and do the initial veining, but this is going to be like straight up. No water. I'm gonna come here, and it might not be perfect. There's some here. This looks awful harsh in that light area, so I'm gonna just kind of lighten it by dabbing with this damp sponge. And that makes it feel like it recedes down into the rock a little bit. I'm essentially following the stuff that already exists. I'm not matching it completely because I don't want it to look like perfect. But right, if you're thinking about it three-dimensionally, this is where the rock has actually come to the surface, or where the sediment has come to the surface, and the rest of it is kind of receded further down. So maybe this guy comes here. This one's a little unusually shaped. I could have one that kind of comes here. And I'm going to fade that one out a touch. Fade it out a little bit here. Oh, that didn't work. Let's do that. Okay. So I'm just popping some of these veins a little bit, essentially. And there might be some that are a little bit more detailed. Like you might have this little guy like that. And this little guy might go all the way over to there. Yeah. This guy maybe has one that kind of connects over there really carefully and lightly. Oops, I think I got rid of too much of that one. Okay. All right, so I think that's all I'm going to do with that color. It's hard to know when to quit sometimes. Less can be more. I'm going to use the same brush, but with a darker brown or a more saturated tan color to kind of be the veining of this tan stuff. And so sometimes you'll have, particularly with certain colors, you might get those really nice dark veins, or you might have really subtle ones. Sometimes they're about the transition from one sediment of rock to another, which kind of looks really like it exists here already. So I'm just going to reinforce that by putting this tan line right across there and give it a little bit of extra punch. Same with this one. I think I'll go ahead and, because now you're sort of telling the viewer that these lines here are supposed to be here. It's not just a brush stroke. It's part of the deal. And again, they can fade and come and go. Like that one looks like it fades out a little bit there. Maybe this one has another, that needs to be a little stronger. More color. Yeah, that looks pretty great. Maybe there's another one up in here that's just kind of randomly in this tan area. All right. So now I would let this dry again. You can also do a light dab of spray on it if you want. A lot of it dries pretty quickly when you're doing that. So the next step, I'm going to put this away to dry and pick up the next one. So as you can see, I've got all that same stuff going on. This one's got a lot of nice spatter happening. I'm kind of happy with this guy. This next one is sort of the same thing, but if you guys remember from that sample, I'm not sure if you do, but there was like a white color that kind of crossed across it really jarringly. They were kind of like directly in opposition to the veining in it. And to me, like, that's really cool, but I think to an audience eye, that might look unnatural and like fake and might give away your painting a little bit. So I'm gonna add them, and I am gonna cross them, but instead of going like directly perpendicular, I'm gonna just kind of soften that angle and kind of come across it this way. Longer than I want it, and I'm gonna just take some water and blend some of it out. What I'm trying to give us the impression of here is that we've got some milkiness from a like clear layer of stuff happening. And then I can use my sponge to kind of soften all of that up on this end. And I'll just soften all that up. So that kind of gives us the impression that there's another layer of something happening there. And if it ends up being too bright, you can always like dab it down, remove it with a rag. I took away more than I wanted to. Okay. Don't call that good. All right. And I'm going to add like another one. Oh man, I am kind of going a little too perpendicular here. Hopefully it doesn't look bad. This is why I'm gonna go this direction with this haziness on this time. Add a little bit more water to that. Water is key here for all this stuff to like soften everything. I think I definitely want to get some softness onto this gray area, because that's going to really help sell that it's receded, so that there's something here kind of on top of it. Yeah. And maybe there's another short guy that doesn't even go all the way. If I recall in the research image, it was very, they were kind of jaggedy. I should have probably made them more jaggedy. I think my other examples that I have pulled up that come next will be more jaggedy. But yeah, so that's, I mean, it seems simple. It's sort of about knowing how to hold the brush and do the brush. A lot of it is about keeping your brush loose and rolling it in your hand as you go, right? Twirling, just letting it flop around a lot. It's definitely not just like paint a line. So I'm going to come back to this sample after we do the dark serpentine sample, because we're going to show you how to seal them and show the shine on the sealer. So I'm going to switch modes for a little bit over to the next example, which is our dark mode. So this is going to be a dark serpentine. And this is done very differently, which is why I wanted to show it to you. It's just to show that you've got all of these tools in your toolbox about how to do this. So in this case, I'm going to be like, we're still building like under texture that we're going to be sort of piling layers on top of to add color. And Oh, I do have an example I've been working from. I'm going to show you. So this is it's like this dark greenish serpentine cracked looking stuff. And I think there's one. I mean, there's some here too on the same page with our other marble. So that's what I'm going for. Mine is probably going to be a little bit busier than that because a lot of this kind of marble is very busy, heavily textured. So the first step on this dude, I use a ragging technique. So here I've got just a wet rag, and I'm dipping it into some was it light gray? I think it was light gray. I don't think I used white. I'm just dipping it into some light gray, and I'm smearing it around into the rag. I might need a little bit more. Rags give you really great random texture, and randomness is key. Again, sort of like when I was spattering on the other one with the dark color, I'm trying to add a texture in a way that's going to give me some guidance onto where to paint lines. Now back to here, I'm just going to literally drop this rag on there. Randomly, I can roll it a little bit, lift it and drop. And it gives you a nice random texture. This is sort of the undercolor. Right, so now I've got the whole thing done. Super handy. It goes by really easily. It makes really messy hands, hence the gloves. But you can also take a sponge, dab out, soften some areas so it's not quite so strong or so distinct. It gives you a little bit of dark areas. You don't want it to look too blotchy, but I kind of think about like the areas that are already sort of naturally dark. I'm trying not, I like this really strong line, so I want to keep a lot of the strong lines. So if it seems like an area feels a little bit like visually weak, you could add a little sponge to it. So that's pretty easy on the first step. So this one has a lot more steps that require it to dry. Instead of doing everything quite so wet, in this case, I could give it a light mist to let it blend out a little bit so it's not quite so strong. And that would be nice. But that's it, and we'll move on to the next step. So we'll let that dry. This one, with the spray, sort of softened up quite a bit compared to that last one. Now I'm going to do the veining, but I'm going to use that bigger brush that I had showed you guys earlier. Again, this is a bit like a heavy cream kind of paint in terms of its thickness. So if you recall from the serpentine examples, these ones, this kind of veining is different than the last kind. It still has really nice long break lines. And so I'm kind of looking in here for some like suggestion from the work about where to do a line. And I feel like there's one that kind of comes here. So you can do super thin, and then it might, this kind of rock tends to do exactly what I was saying earlier, which is that it doesn't do, which is go perpendicular to each other. And it connects a lot of lines, like a lot of lines connect. And there's a lovely variety in there of that kind of stuff. I kind of see one here. Ooh, that guy wants to connect there. I mean, it's So the trickiness of this is like knowing how to make these shapes. So some of this is just practice, and some of it is using your research, right? Like I know I keep harping on it, but research really is like going to help you and tell you how to do this a little bit. So I'm looking for more places to add some lines. Because it's broken. This is really broken rock. So the jaggediness, oh, it's kind of fun to look at it from the camera. It shows you spots you might not normally see. That's really cool. So that guy kind of wants to connect there, I think. How fun. So, sure, I could sit and do this for all the time. And we'll add more little spots here and there as we go. But yeah, so that's kind of how you do that kind of veining. It's different. It's very different than the other one, which is again why I wanted to show you. This makes it look much. You could use the same sort of technique for like a breccia, which is a lot more broken up. Even so, with a light to dark. So for instance, if we use the light gray, you could do this with like a medium gray, so it's much more faint and not quite as strong. But breccia tends to have a little bit more directionality to it than the serpentine stuff for some reason. Again, it's all about what your research looks like. You're trying to mimic what your research looks like. So similar to what we did in some of the other ones, you can do a little bit of fading. I want to keep that in there. So what it is like these lines are veins, but they don't come like they don't just crack across the surface. They also extend down into this translucent material, right? So you want to like give a little bit of sense of that depth to it. This color is maybe just a little too strong. I need more water. And then remove some of that. Soften it as it descends down into the rock, right? And then we'll remove some of that. And it'll feel like it kind of blends with the texture you've already got going on underneath. It doesn't have to be everywhere, every single line, but adding some of that variety is really nice. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and call that good. There's more, I'm sure we could do more, and knowing when to stop is half the battle, but I'm gonna grab, so this one's gonna come with some caveats, and that it was one of the first ones I did and does not look as good as the other ones I've been doing. So you can see, and I'm glad to kind of have it because then it gives me a chance to talk about what works and what doesn't work, right? So you can see down here, it's much more softer, swirly lines, right? And I started correcting it up here where I was like, ooh, much more jagged, much more straight lines is right. So this area here is not exactly where it's at. So I really like this area here quite a bit, but it's not perfect, you know? It ain't perfect. But for this step, it's fine because I can show you what I need to show you and it's not a problem. Okay, so this step, this is where we get our green color into the mix. Yay! So it's a very simple step. All we're doing is doing a wash over the whole surface with green, this translucent green. So the green is just Scenic paint, water, and I've used quite a bit of sealer, which kind of acts like a thicker medium, so it's a little bit thicker than just straight water and paint. And this is going to give us that really great tone and adds depth to the surface, makes the texture underneath feel like it is underneath. You can kind of leave it brush strokey, or you can give it a little squirt of water just to help it make some of the brush strokes go away. I don't hate the brush strokes though. It can kind of look all right. You can also add more in some places so that it's really heavy. You could also do this a second time after it dries. If you want it to be richer or darker, or if your lines feel too bright, you can always tone them down a little bit further. I know it's all wet and hard to see, but so that step is super easy. I'm gonna come to one that's already nice and done. That oven bakes so well. This one I actually did twice because I felt like the white was too bright. I didn't soften it as much as I would have liked. So, but I really like how this one's turning out. So I'm taking the same white color that I had done before. I'm using the little brush, the one we were using to vein with on the other one. We used the big one for the under texture, and I'm going to use the little one for where those cracks are now reaching the surface and looking nice and bright again. All right, so just like before, I am kind of following that line, and it can be broken. It doesn't have to be solid, and it can be lots of varying sizes. And it doesn't even have to stay following the grain the whole time. Getting this to pop back out again. So I'm just starting to add in a lot of these veins. And there's these kind of cracks, they can get even smaller here, right? They can be really delicate and sharp. I'm trying to follow the edges and things that I did underneath a little bit. But I don't have to stick 100% to them, right? Feels like that one wants one there. And it really feels like one wants to go there. Sometimes you might have to blend those transitions in a little bit. This feels like it wants one. And maybe something to lop it off there. So, I mean, gosh, I feel like I could do this forever. It's kind of soothing. I try to think of for this, I try to think of in perpendiculars and triangles. So squares and triangles a little bit more. Sorry, I'm not talking more. I'm just so engrossed in what I'm doing. And you don't have to go over every line that you did underneath. Some of those lines can just stay underneath. I'm trying to let the paint tell me what to do. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it also is true. Like, oh, there's a bump there. That bump looks like it needs to go somewhere or to connect to something. Looking at it in the camera, I feel like it needs something over here yet. See this bump here, it wants to connect. This guy has a line under there. I think that could connect. That kind of wants to connect. If things look too curvy, you sharpen them up. You can sharpen them up by making a straight line there and turn it into a little chunk. Or too pointy. All right, so I mean, yeah, I could literally do this all day because it's fun. but I'm gonna call that good enough. Show you what I'm talking about. Thank you. I have an extra one of these guys. So I thought like you could do more washes to something like this. Where maybe you would use some white to kind of go over the whole area. More water. Yeah, I'm just doing more color over the whole thing, right? You could do it over a whole surface too and leave it kind of streaky and wash it out a little bit more, and that texture will show. It's kind of shiny, so it's hard to see, isn't it? But so you could do a lot more of that too. If for some reason you start looking at your work and thinking like, oh man, that veining is too dark, you really can kind of come back over it. And I would probably use a bigger brush, but they're all dirty, so you could go over the whole thing and tone it down. Or I mean, not even all of it, just parts of it, just to sort of kick it down and lighten it up. Use the sponge to blend it out. You can even add a little bit of spray to soften it. So that's another option you can do. I know, so I showed you a wash where you're washing over the whole thing with color, but you can also just do partial colors too to help make it look milky and translucent as well. The last thing I want to talk about, so I'm going to show you some sealer. Like marble always looks super great and at its best when it's really shiny, which is why at the beginning I was emphasizing using a nice smooth surface. This is probably going to show off all the imperfections of my surface, but so if you want glossy, you can get you some Pledge floor gloss. Revive it. It used to be called Future Floor Wax if you're from back in the day. This stuff is super high gloss and is really great. It's water soluble and it smells delicious like apples. But what's great about it is like it's self-leveling, if you understand what that means. Self-leveling means that once you brush it on, like all your brush strokes go away and it smooths out really beautifully. So you can use whatever the hell you want to apply it with. I've used this on big floors using straight up a mop to mop this stuff on, and it levels out beautifully and looks nice and smooth. That's why I like this for gloss surfaces. The only thing to be cautious about when using this, because it is nice and shiny and it does create that surface, like if you are intending to paint over, so for instance, if you're doing this on your stage floor directly and you're intending to paint over it, you might have to either lightly sand it or mop it with like some ammonia water, because you need something to like chemically cut that shininess so it will, another layer of paint will stick to it. It's not a problem, but it is an extra step that you have to keep in mind if you're wanting to use it. Also, if you're using a stage floor or MDF or whatever it is that has a lot of seams in it, these things, like glosses tend to show or highlight those seams pretty bad. So using really old MDF with lots of holes in it, you might not want to use this. In that case, I tend to just use that garden sprayer and just spray on sealer. And the sealer I use, this is the stuff I use for that. Polyacrylic. It's pretty great. It's made by Minwax. It's not super cheap. It keeps getting more expensive, but it's a water-based polyurethane essentially. So it's super great. And you can thin it down with water. So I usually thin it down 50-50 with water and throw it through one of these guys and spray it. And I use the satin, not the high gloss. You can use the high gloss, but if I'm trying to like make something look a little bit shiny without getting super shiny because the surface is not that nice and smooth, then I use this stuff. But you can also use gloss. Roscoe, the company that makes Scenic paint, also makes a gloss. So I'm literally just going to squirt it on here and apply it with a brush in this case. Maybe a little bit more because I want it to be nice and thick. So what works really well with this stuff as levels out. Oh, this corner didn't get very much. It gets nice and shiny. A lot of the brush strokes will go away as it dries, but you can also do, like, the more layers you put on it, the shinier it gets, just like any floor. And it really makes the surface depth look really nice when it's got a nice shine to it too. It helps add to the illusion of how much depth that surface has. And it's not as dramatic here on this one as I think it's going to be in the dark colored one. But yeah, this one, I think, because it's dark, like when you do like colors on top of dark, sometimes it can look chalky. And so now I haven't sealed this at all yet, so I don't know if this is going to be true. We're going to find out together. But it can make, like, adding sealer will really richen up all the colors on a dark surface. So I'm hoping this is going to really look great once we apply some sealer to it, or once we apply some wax to it. Yeah, I think it really is making that look like some of the stuff that was a little bit lost in the texture underneath there is like popping back out again, which I'm glad for. Yeah, that's working pretty nice. It's maybe hard to see on camera. I can't quite 100% tell what y'all are seeing other than the shiny spots, but you can see our fluorescent lights overhead. But I think it's really richened up the surface. And again, if this light color veining is too strong, you can always do another, like I did a partial wash earlier on that other one. You could do a partial wash on this with a little bit more green in spots to get it to recede in places. And that could work really nice. But that's the bulk of what I had to tell y'all. Otherwise, I thank you guys so much for coming, and I hope you got a lot out of it. Thanks again for coming. If there aren't any more questions, then I will see you guys next Wednesday when we talk about budgets. I know it sounds so exciting, but really it's like how to do theater cheaper.